researching this subject, I read a great deal of literature in regards to the subject at hand. What we'll discuss is part of what could be argued is one of the most significant events in world history. For 6 dark years, almost every nation on Earth was engaged in the most horrific, bloody and total war. The Allies and the Axis powers tore the world apart and scorched the Earth in a fight to the bitter end. It's what happened within the shroud of that war that we are going to talk about tonight. For hidden within the battlefields, within the isolated towns and far from the intervention of anyone, were the war crimes, the unrepentant evil. And whilst war crimes would be committed on both sides and on all fronts of the war, in this episode I'm going to focus on one specific area, and one group of men in particular, who were arguably the most criminal, the most murderous, and the most barbaric. The Einsatzgruppen. In researching this topic, I utilised the writing of Richard Rhodes and his fantastically well-researched book, Masters of Death, the SS Einsatzgruppen and the Invention of the Holocaust, and also The SS, A New History by Adrian Weil. 2 books I highly recommend if you want further reading on tonight's subject. So, into the abyss we dive, and to wallow into the sludge that is death cults, Einsatzgruppen. Many of you will not have heard the word Einsatzgruppen before. It translates from German as quite literally deployment groups or operational groups. The Einsatzgruppen were sub-battalions of the Schutzstaffel, more commonly known as the SS. In creating these sub-battalions, SS Obergruppenführer Reinhard Heydrich and his superior in charge of the SS, Reichsführer Heinrich Himmler, intended to make a unit of intelligent, skilled and fanatical Nazi killers who had one purpose: the complete extermination and annihilation of all Jews, Romani, Bolsheviks and the intelligentsia, particularly political opponents such as communists and liberals. Formed in Prech, a small town in the Saxony region of Germany about 50 miles south of Berlin in the spring of 1941, the Einsatzgruppen had their ranks filled with officers and soldiers who were sworn and fanatical about the Nazi ideology. They were extremist Nazi fanatics, deadly loyal to Adolf Hitler and the false reality of what he sold to the German people. The Einsatzgruppen numbered 3,500, which was split across 7 battalions of 500 men. They were put in place prior to the creation of the concentration camps, when initially the Nazi power cabal assumed that the extermination of the groups they found unsavory could be dealt with using troops and bullets. This would, however, become costly, timely, and laboursome. It also had extremely negative effects on the mental health of the troops within the Einsatzgruppen, with many developing mental health problems and addiction to alcohol and drugs. Prior to this realization, however, the Einsatzgruppen would massacre around 2 million innocent civilians, 1.5 million of which were part of the 6 million Jews that were murdered during the war. Now, the SS were feared throughout Europe. They were said to be the elite Nazi state troops sworn to guard Adolf Hitler and protect the ideology of the Third Reich. Fanatical to the core, even the Wehrmacht, the regular German army, saw the SS as insane fanatical killers and feared them. By 1940, there were around 800,000 soldiers within the SS alone, all oversaw by Heinrich Himmler. Himmler was a cold and calculated senior official. Reichsführer Himmler was second in command of the Third Reich and a devout Nazi. He reported only to Adolf Hitler himself. Himmler was also the architect of the Holocaust, and the creation of the Einsatzgruppen was his first foray into the answer to what became known as Die Endlösung der Judenfrage, or the final solution of the Jewish question. Prior to the creation of the Einsatzgruppen, and prior to the creation of the concentration camps, the Nazi state had begun euthanizing the disabled and mentally ill. This was done on the down low and had happened for several years, even before the start of the war. They were killed using gas vans, which were mobile chambers on wheels where the victims would be placed into the back of the van and Zyklon B would be funneled in and they would die of toxic inhalation of the fumes. Himmler and Heydrich were impressed with the technique, but the volumes of death was slow and small. But at the same time, it was ideal to keep from the German people. Once war broke out, the gas vans were put to bed in favour of the Einsatzgruppen battalions. Now, Himmler thought, he would be able to clear great swathes of undesirables from Europe under the cover of war across the continent and beyond. The Einsatzgruppen were responsible for the murder of much of the intelligentsia and the priesthood initially. They saw Catholics and Christians in general as worshipping a god whose son was the bastard child of a Jewish whore. Once Poland was in German hands, the cultural elite of Poland were also attacked and hunted down by the Einsatzgruppen throughout 1939. Almost all of the people they killed were innocent civilians. They would follow the Wehrmacht into battle and provide support, and once an area was won, the Einsatzgruppen would go to work on the locals, massacring every unwanted element from the society that they perceived. They were a marauding group of serial killers, sanctioned by the state and believing their ideology to be the right thing for Germany and the world. They were cruel, savage, and unforgiving in their crimes. Anyone who was racially inferior in their eyes and who was a political or intelligent challenger to their state or belief system were put to death. Interestingly, so thin and weak was the foundation of the Nazi ideology and the master race that the Third Reich actually banned all comedians in Germany under their rule. This was done as they would not tolerate anyone joking about their beliefs and ideology, no doubt fearing the people would see how wafer thin it actually was. So how, when, and where did these massacres and war crimes take place? Let's dig deeper. At this point, I should warn you guys that this episode does discuss some harrowing and disturbing accounts of murder and torture, so I advise those easily offended or upset to draw their line here and leave the episode. We will be going a lot darker and into areas that are rarely reported in history documentaries and school textbooks. But these are documented and historical facts that should not be kept quiet, to ensure that they may never happen again. All accounts discussed are provided by eyewitnesses to the actual events. Poland. In response to Adolf Hitler's plan to invade Poland on the 1st of September 1939, Reinhard Heydrich was given the task of organizing the Einsatzgruppen into a mission to kill members of the Polish leadership, and also those mostly clearly identified with Polish national identity. So, the intelligentsia, members of the clergy, teachers, and members of the nobility. Approximately 65,000 civilians were killed by the end of 1939. In addition to leaders of Polish society, they killed Jews, prostitutes, Romani people, and the mentally ill. Psychiatric patients in Poland were initially killed by shooting. The final task of the Einsatzgruppen in Poland was to round up the remaining Jews and concentrate them in ghettos within major cities with good railway connections. The intention was to eventually remove all the Jews from Poland, but at this point their final destination had not been determined. Together, the Wehrmacht and the Einsatzgruppen also drove tens of thousands of Jews eastward into Soviet territory. Hitler actually had the idea in 1940 that all the Jews could be rounded up and transported to live on the island of Madagascar, although this would soon be seen as unfeasible. Operation Barbarossa. The Einsatzgruppen worked hand in hand with the Ordnungspolizei, German Nazi state police known as Orpo police battalions. They were sent onto the Eastern Front to carry out operations ranging from the murder of a few people to operations which lasted over 2 or more days, such as the massacre at Babi Yar and Rumbala, which we will come to shortly. The Wehrmacht once again cooperated with the Einsatzgruppen and provided logistical support for their operations, as commanded by Adolf Hitler. The SS may have been ideological extremists and also seen as the military elite to the German people, thanks mostly to German propaganda, but they were inexperienced and poorly trained. This was in comparison to the regular German army, of course. What training they did have consisted of an overabundance of mental conditioning. This was to instill the understanding of the true heritage of the German people and the 1,000-year Reich that was ahead of them. At least, that's what they were brainwashed in. But that fueled their fanaticism, and their hatred drove them forward in an almost unhinged and deranged, utterly brainwashed manner, committing mass war crimes in their wake. for any morality had been removed from them. They were certain what they were doing was for the greater good of the Reich and the German people. They were the best equipped soldiers, and for their faults were very courageous. Members of the Wehrmacht didn't understand their methods, though, and even commented at the time that if they had the basic idea of what they were doing, then perhaps they wouldn't die in such huge numbers. But the SS didn't care. They were dying for their fatherland. Most massacres by the Einsatzgruppen followed a standard format. After an area was invaded and occupied by the Wehrmacht, members of the Einsatzgruppen, the OPO, and any local auxiliaries and collaborators rounded up the local Jewish populations, communist functionaries, Romani, and disabled individuals. These victims were often held in a central location, such as a synagogue or town square, before being taken to a remote area outside of the town or village to be executed. They would often be marched through the town or city to the location of their deaths, often with the local population cheering and clapping their removal. The execution sites were generally prepared in advance, either by the location of a natural pit, ravine, or old quarry, or through the use of forced labor to dig out an area to serve as a mass grave. Individuals who were to be killed were then taken to the location on foot or by trucks supplied by the German army. Once the individuals arrived at the mass grave, the executioners would force them to remove their clothing and valuables and then step up to the edge of the pit. Victims were shot by the members of the Einsatzgruppen or their auxiliaries, who typically adhered to one bullet per person policy. Since not every perpetrator was a polished killer, some victims did not die immediately and instead suffered a slow and painful death or were buried while still alive. While the victims were being killed, other members of the Einsatzgruppen sorted through the victims' personal belongings. These belongings would either be sent back to Germany as provisions for bombed-out civilians, or they would be auctioned off to the local population, and the funds would be utilized to fund further Einsatzgruppen actions and other German military needs. At the conclusion of the massacre, the mass grave would be covered over with dirt. Atrocities. Following the invasion of Russia, the German army captured huge swathes of territory at relatively quick pace. They had pushed through Poland and the Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania, and Ukraine. The Nazis knew that in Eastern Europe there were some 4 million Jews, so in following behind the Wehrmacht, the Einsatzgruppen went to work in an unchallenged and lawless manner. In Ukraine, the following was witnessed by one SS officer who recalled dealing with an orphanage of Jewish children. I went out to the woods alone. The Wehrmacht had already dug a grave. The children were brought along in a tractor-drawn wagon. I had nothing to do with this technical procedure. The Ukrainians were standing around trembling. The children were taken down from the tractor. They were lined up along the top of the grave and shot so that they fell into it. The Ukrainians did not aim at any particular part of their body. They just fell into the grave. The wailing was indescribable. I shall never forget the scene throughout my entire life. I particularly remember a small, fair-haired girl who took me by the hand. She was then taken and shot. The grave was near some woods. Many children were hit 4 or 5 times before they died. Upon entering Kaunas, the second largest city in Lithuania, on the 25th of June 1941, the Einsatzgruppen released the criminals from the city jails and encouraged them to join in their massacring of the Jews, which was already underway. Between the 23rd to the 27th of June 1941, 4,000 Jews were killed on the streets of Kaunas and in nearby open pits and ditches. One criminal in particular, nicknamed the Death Dealer of Kaunas by the Germans, murdered Jews with a crowbar at the Lukatis garage in front of a large crowd of locals who cheered each murder with much applause. He would stop occasionally to regain his strength and play the Lithuanian national anthem on his accordion before resuming the killings, once again for the entertainment of the crowd. In September 1941, Einsatzgruppen set to work on the 17,000 Jews that lived in and around the city of Uman in southern Ukraine. Once again, they were rounded up to the sites of the mass graves. Overzealous SS officers shot down the line, manically laughing with eager hysterics. There was no question that they took great joy in what they were doing. Eyewitnesses said that when mothers with young children and babies were brought to the front to be shot next, to save on bullets, the soldiers snatched the babies by the legs and clubbed them to death with the butts of their weapons in front of their mothers. This was before finally firing on the mothers themselves. Such hate and barbarity, the likes of which can only be matched by Satan himself. Peter Nyman, a young SS officer, recorded in his diary the summer of 1940. July 28th. We occupied the town some days ago. Perhaps I am exaggerating when I call it a town, because all I have seen for miles and miles is ruins and ruins. Fresh orders have reached us and our division. In addition to people's commissars, we are to shoot without trial all Jewish functionaries we find, civil or military. Liquidations, executions, purges, all of these words synonymous with destruction seems completely banal and devoid of meaning once one has gotten used to them. It is a vocabulary which has become of general usage, and we use such words just as we talk about swatting disagreeable insects or destroying a dangerous animal. These words this time, however, are applied to men, but men who happen to be our mortal enemies. The men were following orders, but what did it say about the hierarchy that issued these orders? And orders are one thing, but the relish and eagerness of some of the officers certainly wasn't ordered. Interesting to know is that on the 15th of August 1941, Heinrich Himmler visited one of the Einsatzgruppen battalions at work in Minsk. He had issued the orders to execute the Jews to his SS men, but was curious as to what that actually looked like. He asked the battalion leader how many Jews they had ready to exterminate, to which he was told 100 or so. Himmler requested that they be executed the next morning so that he may witness a mass shooting firsthand for himself. And so it was arranged. When it came to executions the next day, Himmler was visibly agitated, white as a sheet and fidgety. He was also unable to look at anything other than the ground when the shots were fired. When the third round of shots were fired, blood sprayed onto Himmler's face from the head of one of the women victims. Himmler threw up. He had seen enough, although not enough to put a stop to any of the deaths, of course. Babi Yar. The largest massacre perpetrated by the Einsatzgruppen took place just outside Kiev over a 2-day period on the 29th and 30th of September 1941. It was at a ravine northwest of the city called Babi Yar. The Kiev population of Jews were told to report to a certain street corner on the morning of 29th of September. Communication was issued that anyone who disobeyed the order would be shot. Word of massacres in other areas had not yet reached Kiev, and as the assembly point was near the train station, the Jews thought they were to be deported. Huge numbers of people showed up at the meet point laden with possessions, food and luggage. They were marched 2 miles north of the city, where they encountered a barbed wire barrier and Ukrainian police alongside German troops. 30 or 40 people at a time were told to leave their luggage and were escorted through a narrow passageway lined with soldiers brandishing clubs. Anyone who tried to escape was beaten to death. Once they reached a large open area, they were forced to strip and were herded down into the ravine. The Jews were forced to lie down in rows on top of the bodies of other victims, and they were shot in the back of the head by the execution squads. For 2 full days, the murders went on, day and night, resulting in a total of 33,771 victims. Sand was bulldozed over the bodies, and the sides of the ravine were blown up with dynamite to bury the bodies further. Some of the victims, even though buried under sand, rock, and other victims, took more than 3 days to die. Once Soviet prisoners of war, communists, Ukraine nationalists, and Romani were also executed at the site after the Jews, the total number of dead at Babi Yar stood between 100,000 to 150,000 at the hands of the Einsatzgruppen. It was seeing the men handle the executions in Minsk and the way the women and children suffered, in turn with the cost, that made Himmler rethink his plans for the final solution. And following the Wannsee Conference on the 20th of January 1942, Die Endlösung der Judenfrage, of the final solution to the Jewish question was put fully into place with the opening of the concentration camps and large volume stationary gas chambers. One of the last Einsatzgruppen massacres in Eastern Europe were not strictly at their hands. They had come across a Jewish orphanage in Russian-captured territory. The children inside, all under the age of 10, were transported to the new Auschwitz concentration camp in southern Poland. When they arrived, the children were taken from the trucks by SS officers and thrown into a large open fire pit and burned alive, crying and screaming in the process. Some of them, barely alive, managed to crawl from the flames of the pit, only to be pushed back in by SS officers with long fire-stoking poles. There were plans for Einsatzgruppen battalions, 6 in total, to accompany the Wehrmacht into Britain following the successful implementation of Operation Sea Lion, the Nazi invasion of Britain. If it had succeeded, the Einsatzgruppen would have been tasked with capturing Winston Churchill and his cabinet and many top member MPs, as well as the British intelligentsia, British Jews, Charles de Gaulle and the Free French Resistance, and the Czechoslovak government, who were in exile in the UK. As had happened with other countries in Europe, they would have likely been executed, with Churchill publicly hanged or beheaded as a symbolic gesture to the British people. Fortunately, the Luftwaffe lost the aerial battle of Britain to the Royal Air Force, and Hitler postponed plans for Operation Sea Lion. Those plans would be permanently quashed following the Allied invasion of mainland Europe in June 1944 and the destruction of the Nazi regime. After the close of World War II, 24 senior leaders of the Einsatzgruppen were prosecuted in the Einsatzgruppen trial in 1947 and 48 at Nuremberg. They were charged with crimes against humanity and war crimes. 14 death sentences and 2 life sentences were handed out. 4 additional Einsatzgruppen leaders were later tried and executed by other nations. Today, surviving members of the SS and Einsatzgruppen will tell you that they witnessed the horrors but never took part. But I don't think that can be the case. The Wehrmacht, too, committed crimes against humanity. In looking back now from the perspective of the 2019, it seems that for 6 years some nations of the world went into temporary insanity, and it's difficult to ever explain why. But I hope that never again mankind will peer into the flames of hell like we did in the 1940s. By 1945, 6 million Jews were dead, murdered at the hands of the Nazis, and 1.5 million of those deaths were directly due to the Einsatzgruppen squads, one of the most evil, murderous, and deadly of all death cults. Thank you as always for joining us tonight for this dark and difficult subject. We'll be back later this week with another episode. Consider subscribing so you don't miss out, and I highly recommend that you follow us on Instagram. We are at dead_souls_podcast. We post daily stories, mysteries, and dark history, as well as podcast updates. And if you are checking out our Instagram, you might also be interested in our Patreon. Pledge a few bucks and you can get pretty cool rewards and extras. Plus, it also really helps us out in making more of these episodes for you guys. If you can head on over to patreon.com/deadsouls, please show us some support and join the Dead Soul Social Club. One last thing. We have finally agreed the first of our exclusive guest interviews. We are very lucky to get this person on the show, and we cannot wait for you to hear our conversation. It'll be part of a 2-part series, so subscribe and stay tuned for that. It's going to be huge. Take care of yourselves, everyone, and sleep tight. And remember, stand firm as you enter the darkest night.